one more time. Another day, another misbelief. This never-ending thing called history. These people seem to know one thing, yet it's not said when you may think one more time.
I did not know until today. This is not a revolution.
One more time.
This musical's a rebellion. An obscure event of old now. One more time for everyone.
Will the world ever know?
One more time for those who don't care. Oh, the historic timeline.
And I swear this all is true.
It's a different century. One more time before the street.
It's June of 1832.
At the barricades of freedom. Historians everywhere are screaming.
Do you know your history?
Do you know what year it is? It is 1832.
One more time, it's a rebellion in Bourbon Restoration, beginning the July monarchy. That still is a lot of blood.
Napoleon is dead, has been for a while.
We still
Not a king, so that's kind of wild. Yes, it still is France, and we are in Paris. Most of this is fiction, get the facts straight, please. One more time for information. This is not the reign of terror. There's a new rebellion, 'cause this is France. Do you hear the historian sing?
It is
1832.
one time
Napoleon is dead, has been for a while.
We still
Not a king, so that's kind of wild. Yes, it still is France, and we are in Paris. Most of this is fiction, get the facts straight. It is unknown until today. This is not a revolution. We want you to discover when Les Misérables is really sad. One more time,
Wrong revolution!
Hello, I am Marie Walker, and today we are going to be talking about the history behind the musical Les Misérables. So, as you could probably tell from our delightful video that we put together, Les Mis is not set during the French Revolution as, for some reason, a good number of people on the internet may think. So, we're going to give some historical context to when Les Mis is actually set. It is set between 1815 and 1832, with the big rebellion that everyone thinks about being the climax of Les Misérables in 1832. So let's talk about how we got there for just a second. So the book starts out in 1815. Napoleon isn't even in charge. The French Revolution has already happened. So let's go back to the actual French Revolution, because that's the major turning point in French history, and also you could argue world history, because it really, America has their revolution, France has their revolution, monarchies are crumbling across Europe and creating perhaps more fair-ish democracies. At least that's the idea, and that doesn't necessarily happen in actuality, especially in France. So in France, you have the French Revolution. It starts in 1789, which is really fun to remember because it's just 1789. And then it goes for about 10 years, and then it technically ends in 1799. That's when you have Marie Antoinette, Louis XVI. They get beheaded. The guillotine is being used hundreds upon hundreds of times a day. That's when you have Robespierre. That's when you have all of those people getting their heads chopped off via guillotine. That doesn't happen during Les Mis. We're like 26 years that way. But for historical timeline purposes, that's where we're starting. So French Revolution, that all happens. I'm not going to get into a bunch of the specifics of the French Revolution because that would take the entire live stream. And we're talking about Les Mis. So French Revolution. Then you have Napoleon. Napoleon comes in with his empire. That's technically the first empire of France. That lasts from about the end of the French Revolution to 1814. So, and then he kind of comes back because he gets exiled, and then there's like 100 days where he's technically in charge of France, and it gets complicated. But technically, that ends in 1814. Les Mis starts in 1815. That's when Jean Valjean's story really begins. That's when Victor Hugo's, when he puts pen to paper, it's actually 1840. But he's talking about 1815, and that's when Les Mis starts. And that's actually during the Bourbon Restoration. So after Napoleon gets kicked out of power, you have the Bourbon Restoration, which means France has a king again. So they didn't actually get a democracy like they thought they were going to. They got an emperor, and then they got a king again. So the Bourbon Restoration is actually the life of two kings put together, and that is the life of Louis XVII, which is brother of Louis XVI, who, well, actually it's the 18th because you skipped the 17th because that was Louis XVI's son who died in prison during the French Revolution. So that's why there is no actual King Louis XVII. It goes straight to 18th. So you have, when Les Mis starts, you have King Louis XVIII on the throne. And then when he dies, his brother Charles X takes over. And that lasts from 1815 to 1830. And then people get upset again in 1830, and they have the July Rebellion. And then that kind of puts into power, I think, oh dear. Anyway, so July Rebellion happens. They actually get, the Duke of Orleans. He becomes king. And Charles X, and then it's kind of like a constitutional monarchy, but then he puts in a bunch of other more repressive regimes, kind of restoring the French aristocracy, and people get really upset. And that's right when all of what we think of the climax of Les Mis is really happening, is right after the July Rebellion, leading into the, July Revolution. It's a revolution because they actually toppled the government and made them change their position of leadership. And then you're going to the July Revolution, June Rebellion of 1832. There's so many revolutions and rebellions in France in the 19th century. They keeps changing. After the July Revolution and then the June Rebellion, then there's give it another few years, and then there's another revolution. But that's past Les Mis, so we aren't actually going to talk about that today. But we're really going to focus in here on the June Rebellion. It's a rebellion because it didn't actually succeed in toppling the government. It just was people voicing their unrest and, distress and distrust and general disapproval of the government at the time. June Rebellion, believe it or not, starts in June of 1832, and it goes on for about 3 days. And this is brought on by, one, a cholera epidemic, which is taking over the city, which has a lot of people dead or diseased and sickly. It also has pretty much ruined their economy. It has made plain the widening wealth gap between the elites and the poor, which they thought was going to get fixed with the French Revolution back about at that point it'll be at least 30 years ago. And it really didn't. There wasn't a whole lot of lasting change because with the Bourbon Restoration that just happened before this, a lot of the old players came back, and it didn't seem like all that much had changed. And all of the people who are on the lower end of society are still very upset and don't don't feel like they're being heard. And that's why people get really, really upset when, after this cholera epidemic and this wealth gap, General Lamarck dies. Now, who is General Lamarck? You might be asking. If you've seen Les Mis, you have heard the name, and this is him right here. So General Lamarck was a member of the French Parliament, because when the Bourbon Restoration happened and after the July Revolution, France kind of became more of a constitutional monarchy, where kings are not ruling by divine right, but by constitutional power, which means instead of believing that God has given this one person the divine right to rule over all, instead of the power coming from God, the power has come from this constitution, which the people have created, and therefore it's perhaps a little bit more diplomatic, because there is some limits and powers to what the king can do. So you do have a parliament that rules with the king, and Lamarck is one of those people in that parliament. But he dies of cholera because of the epidemic. And then he was the only person who was really speaking up for the lower classes. And therefore, now all of the lower classes and more progressive people feel like they have absolutely no one to speak up for them in Parliament, and therefore they feel the need to rebel. And that's when you have Les Mis. This is when you have the June Rebellion. And this is a depiction, an engraving of the June Rebellion. Its photography is very, very new at this point, and I think the first photograph was happening around 1830, 1840, but we don't actually have any photographs of the June Rebellion, because you still had to hold very still for your photograph to be taken, and these people were not. They were actively fighting for their lives. So that is actually a depiction of what people think the June Rebellion looked like in 1870. So it's very much like you think of in Les Mis. You have the barricades in the streets. You have this small population of mainly younger people who are idealistic and want the government to change, out in the streets fighting for the change they want to see. It goes very, very poorly for them. It lasts about 3 days. There are about 800 people die because the military comes out and puts down this rebellion because the government doesn't want to listen to them. And that's when you have, so in Les Mis, you have Marius, who is this idealistic young student who is part of a fictional organization called the ABC Cafe. And if you are a fan of the musical like I am, you probably know the song, the ABC Cafe / Red and Black, where they talk about basically forming this rebellion. And then you have the rebellion, and then you have the song Empty Chairs at Empty Tables, where Marius is the only one to have survived because Jean Valjean came and basically he saved his life. These are not real organizations, they're fictional, but they're very much based upon, the ABC Cafe is based upon small student organizations like the ones that actually promoted the June Rebellion and were very instrumental in forming that rebellion. So now we're going to talk a little bit about Victor Hugo, who was the man who was behind the genius that is Les Mis. Victor Hugo was born in France, so all of Les Mis and his works were written in French originally, and then they have been translated to English and pretty much every other language you can think of, and have been read around the world, as his work has joined the ranks of classic literature. Pretty much. He wrote Les Misérables. He also wrote The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which you might also be familiar with. It's also a Disney cartoon, because these works have not only just been, they weren't just written and then stayed in the 18th century, they are still part of our popular culture today, with Disney with their Hunchback of Notre Dame cartoon. There have been countless movies done of Les Misérables, that being either a straight adaptation of the book or an adaptation of the musical, which also is incredibly popular, which I loved. And obviously you can see here at the History Center we enjoy enjoy the more theatrical side of historical interpretation as well. So we're going to start with Victor Hugo writing Les Misérables. So he wrote it in the 1840s. He was not an active participant in the June Rebellion, as far as we can tell, but he was in the streets of Paris at the time, and as the story goes, he heard the gunshots and he didn't know what was happening, so he actually went towards the gunshots, and then he got not necessarily caught in crossfire, but he was caught very close to it, and he had to duck behind a pillar and stay there for a very long time until it was safe for him to come out, because there was fighting in the streets. So he did have a very up close and personal encounter and experience with the June Rebellion. And then, of course, he had also been witness to the turbulent political everything in France in the early 19th century. He begins writing Les Misérables in the 1840s, and then it is published in 1862, I do believe. And it is an instant success. It was very much, you think of it's really, some people are not popular in their own lifetime. Victor Hugo definitely was. And it wasn't just popular in France. It was incredibly popular in France. But if you want to go across the sea to America, where we are today, it was also very, very popular in America. And if following the historic timeline, it actually doesn't get over to America until 1863, which is right in the middle of the American Civil War, because it had to be translated to English. So in 1863, it makes its debut in America. It's really popular with American Civil War soldiers. You have on the North and the South sides, because I think one of the most why Les Mis is so enduring is because it speaks to the human condition in so many ways, and people identify with it so strongly, or they identify with certain characters very strongly. And these, it talks about this rebellion, and basically, the southern states were in rebellion. They didn't actually succeed. They didn't have a revolution. They didn't topple a government. It was a rebellion that the North then put down. So there's a lot of parallels to it that you can see, and it made it very, very popular. And Les Mis was being read across American Civil War battlefields till the war's end. There was actually a group of Southern soldiers who called themselves Les Miserables, after the Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Basically, they just took instead of lay, they put in Lee, which is kind of punny. But one of the very, very interesting things about Les Misérables in the South is that from some of the surviving copies, it seems that the South wasn't exactly reading the same book as the North was, or the rest of the world, because certain printers changed all references to slavery and took out references to slavery, because Victor Hugo was a huge abolitionist and really liked John Brown, who was an American abolitionist. Some people even think that Valjean was based upon John Brown. I'm not sure. That definitely cannot be proven in any way, but it's an interesting theory. I'm not sure if how much correlation there is to that, but nevertheless, we do know that Victor Hugo was an abolitionist, despised slavery, was not a supporter of the Confederate government by any means, and yet a lot of people in the Confederacy still really liked his work, even though it was redacted in some sense, and references to slavery were either taken out or changed in some of the works that we see. Because during the American Civil War, no one was really paying attention to copyright laws by any means. People had few other things on their mind. Especially, I don't think the South even put into motion any copyright laws, and they were not listening to the Union to do anything, because they were in rebellion. So that's just a really interesting tidbit of history there. That's is American Civil War connection to Les Misérables. Victor Hugo's works continue to be incredibly popular throughout the 19th century. In 1888, we start to see engravings. There's always been engravings, but there's one incredibly famous engraving that you might actually recognize today that we are going to have pulled up here. So you might actually recognize this because it's still used on publications for Les Misérables. It's basically, I consider this to be the face of Les Misérables. When you think of the musical, at least, it's usually this girl's face. And then, you have the tricolors that represent France. But the first image that you see right here was actually an engraving done in the 1800s that was used as promotion for the book. And in the book, they had some illustrations, one of which is obviously this one, which is Cosette, when Jean Valjean goes to pick her up from the Thénardiers. And this poor child who has been suffering is then taken and given what you would consider to be a better life with Jean Valjean, even if you are on the run for a crime that you did commit but should not have gotten that much of a sentence for stealing a loaf of bread. There's just so much in Les Mis, so much. It's kind of like a soap opera. Seems like kind of like the original idea of a soap opera to me. But just that idea, I thought it was incredibly interesting that this engraving from the 1800s has become something that we also recognize as popular culture. So it's fun how history, we don't realize how much a history is a part of our everyday lives. And that leads me to the musical adaptation of Les Misérables, which is probably one of the most famous musicals, one of the longest running musicals in American musical theater and around the world, because Les Mis was actually, it was composed and written in 1980 in French, and then it became translated into English during, I think it was 1982 or 3. It was in that time frame which it became translated, rehearsed, and then put to a stage. And then it hasn't lost favor, really. It's been going strong for the last 20, 30, 40 years, which also speaks to the enduring nature of the story of Les Misérables. Because after that, you've had countless TV, movie, different media presentations of the musical, as well as the work that Victor Hugo wrote. So I think that's a pretty good overview of the history of Les Mis, as well as its inclusion into our popular culture. So let's go into some questions if we have any of those.
All right. So I'm wondering, can you talk to us about the experience of women of different social classes that are represented throughout Les Mis? I know that we have the experience of Cosette, Fantine, Eponine, and of course the ensemble characters are also, many of them represent different women. So can you give us the historical context of the differences in the lives of the social classes for women?
Yes. So, I felt I needed to repeat the question, but we don't need to do that anymore. Fantastic. So let's start at the beginning. One of the first female characters that we meet in the book and or the musical is Fantine. And her life is one of, she starts out pretty low in the stratosphere, in the hierarchy of social economics. And then she pretty much falls to the bottom until her demise. From her and her historical context, we see in the beginning of industrialization as she works in a factory. If you worked in a factory, you had really long, really hard hours, and you didn't receive as much pay as one would think would be necessary for working that long and that hard. And if you were there, then you had no opportunity for societal advancement for the most part. And then, of course, we know the Thénardiers are pretty much extorting her, saying that her child is sick and that they need more money to buy medicine. and therefore she has to get more money. She gets fired from her job because they realize she had a child out of wedlock, and that's another thing that society really frowned upon, was women who they considered to be quote unquote like loose women or have loose morals or something of that nature, because they had this child out of wedlock, even though she said like the husband had just died. They didn't believe her, and therefore it's, unless she moved, but she probably didn't have means to move, what do you do? No one's going to hire you in like a small society like that, where word like that probably gets around like wildfire when people have nothing better to do than gossip, to some extent. So then what do? You still need money. So then you go down, she begins her more descent into what people would consider the lower tiers of society, and that would be like prostitution. Prostitution, at least in the novel and the musical, seems to be just a common practice, and they definitely existed, as they have throughout history. Some people call that the oldest profession for women. And once she reaches there, she doesn't climb back out of the hole. She basically stays there until she gets sick and dies, which is very sad. The song I Dreamed a Dream is incredibly moving, and I think a very good depiction of how her life went and how she wanted it to go. And then we'll move on to her child, which is Cosette, who was placed with a family to be raised, even though, because the idea of a single working mother in this time period did not exist, really, unless you were widowed, which she attempted to pass off as. But if you had a child out of wedlock, people just considered you a societal outcast, and do you want to risk that? So she left this child to be raised with the Thénardiers, which is also the parents of Eponine. And I think it's incredibly interesting in a literary sense. I think Eponine and Cosette are very much foils to each other, because at the beginning of the novel, when Jean Valjean goes to get Cosette from the Thénardiers, Eponine is living a rather cushy life. They're doing well. They're running this boarding house, and they seem to be doing all right for themselves, and she's dressed nicely and seems to get everything she wants. And then you have Cosette, who's working, her fingers to the bone, doing manual labor, and she's a child. And then when Jean Valjean rescues her and they begin to build their new life together, then Eponine's family doesn't do as well, and she becomes more or less of a street urchin, as they are depicted. So Cosette, she moves from basically being a servant, which is very low class, to being the daughter of Jean Valjean, who is very well respected in the community, or becomes very well respected in the community, and has a pretty cushy life. She gets to do all of the more high societal things, which means you probably have a better education. You can read, you can write. At this point, female education isn't considered as important, so she didn't go to college or anything like that. A lot of colleges didn't accept women at this time period. It was just beginning in the 1830s. Some colleges were just beginning to accept women, and or colleges specifically for women were becoming created. We have one in Georgia, which I believe was the earliest to grant degrees to women, which is Wesleyan College, and I believe it started in the 1830s. I'm not sure about Paris. I would have to go look into that. But she would be also taught things like music and dance and embroidery, so she can do needlework and how to basically become a homemaker and mother and societal lady, hostess, things like that. That's what Cosette's life is going to entail, more or less. Where then Eponine, we see her to be more or less living on the streets, which means you have to fend for yourself to survive. and survival by any means necessary is how I see that. So her life is going to be very different. It's probably not going to involve any sort of education. It's not going to involve dance and society. It's not going to have any of the comforts and or pleasures that the 1830s middle class provided Cosette. For Madame Thénardier, that's going to be very similar to Eponine, and I think hard to tell with the Thénardiers. They're just kind of all over the board because they're kind of con artists, but I don't think they're not going to be welcomed into high society, even if they do kind of work their way up. They're always going to be considered kind of an other, and because they weren't born into money, and they weren't, even though French Revolution kind of redefined all of this and people were technically thought to be equal, but then you have, the monarchy come back, and then the elites of the old French aristocracy come back, and then you have society starting to stratify itself again. So Thénardiers are just kind of everywhere, or they at least they pretend to be everywhere. They're probably more on the lower class of society, which means like you aren't going to have access to good hygiene and or education. Does that cover all the women? Am I missing any of the women?
I think that does cover it. But talking about upward mobility during this time,
Yes.
could that even be achieved? And perhaps was this part of the reason that folks were rebelling? Can you talk to us just about that community frustration and what life was like for the lower classes, and if there was any possible way for them to acquire upward mobility?
I think this is incredibly interesting because we have two characters in Les Mis who show you can obtain upward mobility. You have Javert and you have Jean Valjean, who, according to one song, it's, I'm from the gutter too. They both were born into poor circumstances, and then through life choices, they got to where they were at the end of the musical. Javert became a law enforcement officer and therefore redeemed himself in his own eyes. And then you have Jean Valjean, who was born into not fantastic circumstances, stole a loaf of bread to feed his sister's son, was punished for it with almost becoming he was a prisoner and worked on a chain gang and was in prison for at least 15 years until he got to go. And then he was trying to run from his criminal record because if you had a criminal record, then you were also considered an outcast, and no one really wanted to hire you and or give you any type of food, lodging, housing, anything like that. So he hides his criminal record. He is basically given not necessarily money, but silver from the incredibly kind-hearted priest. And then he decides to change his life around because he has some of this silver. He can then go and attempt to start a new life for himself, as long as no one figures out he's a criminal. So you see Jean Valjean becoming a more respected member of society, but also being very protective of this upward mobility that he has, because he doesn't want anyone to find out and then have himself slide back down. And the idea of slide back down the societal ladder. And also he's trying to do this for his adoptive daughter, Cosette. So we do see some trend of upward mobility. You also have characters like Marius, who are from an upper tier of society, perhaps, because he's a student. That means he's going to university. One of the lines about the rebellion is this just a game for rich young boys to play? Because you have these rich young students who aren't exactly from the lower classes. They just want to help the lower classes. So they're thinking, rebellion, this is how we fix it. so you have a lot of different, and then you have, the Thénardiers and Eponine and Gavroche, who are really the bottom tier of society, who are living pretty much on the street in slums, and they're kind of involved in this rebellion, but not incredibly. Of course, they're all angry and upset because they were promised this better society in the French Revolution, and it hasn't seemed to come to fruition yet. It seems to have gone back to an emperor and then a king. So I think a lot of people were probably just disheartened and thought, well, no one cares, so why should I attempt to make anyone care? And then you also have these people who are still idealistic and want that more equality and make it so that people can have social mobility. And in the 1830s, you still don't have all that public, you don't have public sanitation. It's not fantastic. That's why you had a cholera outbreak. And then you also don't have a whole lot of public education, so people can't necessarily better themselves through education. So social mobility would be very hard to do at that point in time, but it's not impossible because we do see two characters do it. Of course, these two characters are men, and therefore, in this society, they are able to climb that ladder higher. Because if you think about this, Fantine was so scared and got fired for having a kid out of wedlock, but then Jean Valjean's sung as this hero for adopting this child, and no one questions where her mother is.
All right. So now, when it comes to Javert, there seems to be a real struggle with him when it comes to this idea of sort of like absolutism with law and order and moral codes. But Valjean seems to disrupt that because he, especially in the moment when he saves Javert's life. Can you speak to the societal understanding? I mean, what when it comes to religion at the time, what were most people practicing at that time? How did it affect their everyday life? And maybe speak to the character of Javert and how he changes, or at least has that challenge due to Valjean.
Okay, so if we're going to talk about France and religion, we're going to go back to like the Middle Ages, and with Notre Dame, which is this figure, this beautiful Gothic church that is the setting for another one of Victor Hugo's novels, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. So, well, I was going to say the Catholic Church, but at that point when Notre Dame was built, it was just the church. It was, which today we know as the Catholic Church because of the Protestant Reformation and then the split that happened with Protestants and then Catholics. So France remained pretty heavily Catholic during that split in the Reformation and continued to be very heavily Catholic and continued to do so, at least in practice, if not, or in name, if not in practice, through the beginning of the French Revolution. When you have the French Revolution, I think it was Robespierre. One of the early people who got into power kind of abolished all religion and declared themselves God and then paraded around in a toga. And it was a very interesting, confusing time for everyone. And then they redid the entire calendar for France to get rid of like all of the holidays, which are holy days. And I think they added in a couple other months too. It was a lot. It was a whole lot. So you have, and also then the Enlightenment came, and then you have also Napoleon, who, there was a lot of still like Catholic tradition going on, but then there was also a whole lot of like this Enlightenment idea of being an atheist, became kind of in fashion for a time. And then, so you have, to put it complicatedly, religion at the time, there was a lot of questions and confusion surrounding what France was nationally. I would venture to say there were still a very large number of Catholic people who kept the Catholic faith throughout all of that. But what the government said about religion had just gone through a whole lot of change. But then, of course, you have the Bourbon Restoration. I think you have more of the government being more Catholicized again. So that was complicated. I hope that made sense. So then you have the two characters of Jean Valjean and Javert, and they call into question what is morally right, I think. Is it, law and order? Is it doing what's right by your fellow man? What is the moral compass, and how does that go? How does that religion play into that? I think that's I don't know if I can answer that question, because I think that's more of a personal, I think that's basically what the book is trying to make you think about, is what is morally right, and is what is morally right always what's legal?
Great answer. Yeah. I think there's a lot to consider with that.
Yeah.
So now I'm also wondering, how did France, if it did change significantly after this particular rebellion, what did change?
So a lot changed with the July Revolution, which happened a couple years before this rebellion. Not a whole lot changed after this rebellion. It's really an obscure historical event, except for the fact that Les Mis is set during it. It really did almost nothing. It did, except get a lot of people killed. It got about 800 people killed, and 800 people lost their lives, and it told the government that these people were unhappy with what was going on. But it really isn't until 1848 when you have another revolution where people actually affect change. Rebellions affect some change because they show that there is unrest and unhappiness with things how are generally going. But unless it's a revolution, it doesn't affect a complete governmental change. So in 1848, you get the Duke of Orleans thrown over. Yes, you get him thrown over, and then someone else gets put in, and then the Second Empire of France begins, which is really interesting because you have the First Empire, and it's not directly followed by the Second Empire because you have the whole Bourbon Restoration, July monarchy thing going on.
So when you say Bourbon Restoration, why bourbon? What does that refer to?
So the Bourbon Restoration is not... I assume French, like the drink bourbon, comes from France. If not, it's just a very interesting coincidence. But Bourbon is the last name of the French monarchy. So when I say Bourbon Restoration, it's basically restoring the House of Bourbon. So, you have like the House of Windsor is what rules England, and you have, or if you want to go in a Game of Thrones reference, you have the House of Stark and all of those other things. There are these houses battling. The House of Bourbon is the French monarchy.
Can you talk to us about, did women ever actually fight during this rebellion, or were there other ways that they pushed back or fought for change in their own way?
So, I have no idea if women fought in this rebellion or not. It seems to be depicted in Les Misérables, in the novel, and in the musical. Yes and no. You have Eponine, who has this message that she wants to get to Marius, and she ends up dying on the barricade, and she's the first one to die on the barricade. Her blood is spilled first upon the barricade. So women were, at least depicted in Les Mis, involved in some way. Whether that be fighting with a gun, it's very hard to tell because we don't have any necessarily firsthand accounts and or pictures. We just have those graphics which were created a long time after the actual rebellion, and they only depict a small scene of what someone thought they saw. So it's, Eponine, she disguised herself as a man, and that's actually a very interesting point. If a woman successfully disguised herself as a man, we have no record of that woman fighting because she was considered a man. We aren't exactly sure how many, unless they come out later and say, I disguised myself as a man to go fight. We have no record of them fighting or as a woman, even though they were a woman just disguising themselves as a man. So we don't have no account for that, but that doesn't mean that it didn't necessarily happen. That would all be one of those fun things that historians like to do, which is theorize about what could have happened because we aren't exactly sure. And that's the complicated thing with history. Unless we have like a primary source document or a picture or something, it's hard to tell exactly. So there's a lot of historians like to give their educated opinion, their educated guess about what could have happened. So that would be my theory, is a woman could definitely have disguised herself as a man and taken a gun and gone up to a barricade, or a woman just dressed as, fully appreciating her identity as a woman, dressed as a woman, not trying to disguise herself, could also have taken up a gun. We just don't know.
And can you speak to Victor Hugo's own upbringing? Was he what social class was he in? And to the best of your knowledge, why would he really care about these issues and abolition? I mean, where does that come from, if you do know?
So I can talk a little bit about Victor Hugo. He is definitely mid to upper class. He seemed to not have the most happiest of childhoods. It didn't seem like his parents got along all that well. And then, which is his own personal life, which is also, I always think it's really interesting because some people say, no, you have to evaluate the book separate from the author. You can't intertwine them because they're two separate entities. And I think to an extent, yes, that's true. But also, if you take away the person who put the pen to the paper when you're evaluating it, you miss a lot of perhaps overlap, because I think a lot of authors use their personal life and or personal struggles as inspiration for their work. So of course the work can stand on its own merit, but I think it's just an interesting, and you get to perhaps read a little more into it when looking at the life of the author as well. And in one of these, some people like to theorize. So Victor Hugo had this love that he really liked this girl, and they ended up getting married, but his mother didn't approve of the girl. I'm not necessarily sure why, so they had to wait until his mother his mother died to get married, and they got married like several days after she died. And then they lived together as man and wife for a while, and then they got divorced, and then he met this other woman. Well, I think if you really, the timeline is not that certain. I'm pretty sure he met this other woman before they got divorced, and his other wife was also not exactly faithful to him and had affairs. And then he met this other girl and fell in love with her in like a day, and then faithfully stayed with, we assume faithfully, stayed with her until their dying day, and they had this incredibly burning passion love for each other, which a lot of people point to as Eponine and Cosette, and then thinking of Victor Hugo as Marius. And of course, I think these characters, it's not necessarily autobiographical by any means, but it makes you wonder if these influenced his writing of these characters at all. And then if you do think of Victor Hugo as Marius, if he's this rich young student during the time of the rebellion and these things going on, maybe it's perhaps his education, where he believed that everyone should be equal in society or have a more equal and fair attitude towards society. I'm not necessarily sure where he got his abolitionist sympathies or cause and motivation for. France abolished slavery during the French Revolution. So France at that point had been a free nation that no longer held African American, or not African American people because they're in France, held people who were taken from Africa as slaves anymore for all of the 1800s. And we're working towards a more free and equitable society throughout the turbulent 19th century. So perhaps that could be it. Because France had abolished slavery for so long, America still had slavery, to where they thought America should be like France and abolish slavery.
All right, and to conclude, can you let us know what are some other resources that folks can dive into if they're interested in this era, or more about Les Mis, the musical and book itself?
All right, so resources. Let's see. Let's think of what. Of course, you can go to Google and then type in Les Mis and Les Mis history. That's always. You never know what you're going to get, but it's an interesting place to start. I also was watching, there's YouTube videos called Crash Course, and it gives a nice overview of historical topics, which include the French Revolution, the Bourbon Monarchy Restoration, I believe there's one about the June Rebellion, or that one might be tossed in with the Bourbon Restoration one. And then you can also learn, they have one, I think, about the July Rebellion, or July Revolution, June Rebellion, and then the Revolution of 1848. So I think that would be an interesting thing to go look into. You could also, I think there's like several, I have like a book where it's like Les Mis, and then they give like a little bit of brief overview of, it's really just like the sheet music for Les Mis, but in the beginning of it, they have like a nice little overview of the history of the musical and the book and the time period itself. So that'd be something to look into. If you are interested, there's a lot of just different adaptations of Les Mis, and I think each adaptation does something different and unique that gives you a little bit of a different look at the story and or the time period. So I think looking at any of those will give you more information about that. I'm trying to think if there's any other, just like, I can't think of like a companion book. Oh, there is a book called Les Misérables, which is about the American fascination with Les Mis, and that is a historical book, nonfiction book. I would be interested in if you were looking at it from an American's perspective at the time of its publication.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Marie. And we appreciate everyone joining us today. And we do hope that this will be a series, since we were just talking about how so many musicals we can offer historic context. So thank you, Marie. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. My pleasure.